So what are we going to do here for these day and a half? How are we going to organize ourselves? How are we going to like move this ball forward? Well, we've really tried to organize this as a lot of a thinking and sharing time, because the wisdom's in the room and we're trying to get those connections going and then build upon them. And we just sort of have some key questions we want people to sort of ponder as they think about what would this next generation of indicators and response look like? How do we build these pathways to success? And you know, one of the things we want to think about of this, because you guys are all doing this work, is like, why hasn't it been done yet? Like, this seems straightforward, right? If we've got to move all our kids through some sort of pathways to post-secondary success, why don't we have a good system of indicators and supports along the way? So as soon as a kid says, having a little trouble, this isn't working for me, this path isn't quite right, we make adjustments and we get them on the right path. Like, why isn't that just normal? Why isn't that just how schools are organized? Well, the answer is, right, is there's both human and technical challenges standing in the way of that, right? And we are at very best rebooting, I mean, very least rebooting our system. At more likely, we are sort of, you know, almost revolutionizing it, right? Because our current K-12 and higher education systems were not designed in the 20th century with the idea that all kids would graduate high school and all kids would go to post-secondary. They are based on a premise that a portion of kids would graduate and go on to the post-secondary. Others would go right into the workforce. Others would you know, have different pathways. We're now saying, right, that we have to really build this thing that all kids have got to have that opportunity, right? And that really has to change how we organize ourselves. So that's one reason, big reason why it hasn't happened yet, right, is we've really changed the goals. And if you change the goals, you have to change the systems, right? Because the system is designed for the old goals, and it's really built upon that foundation. And part of the stress we face, right, is it was really successful in its old goals. I mean, the comprehensive American high school drove the nation to prosperity and a degree of social integration in the 20th century, right? In 1920, 1910s, we were in another Gilded Age with huge differences of wealth between rich and poor, huge limited accesses to upward mobility for the middle class. And many people have argued it was the building a comprehensive neighborhood high school. All kids in the same town went to the same high school, mixed up. Maybe they weren't all in the same classes, but they were in things together, and there was a sense of community. And that built a pipeline to both work and college. The world has changed. That system doesn't work that well anymore, right? The high schools that really struggle, that still have low graduation rates, they are almost exclusively in communities that are cut off economically and socially from the 21st century. They are in those parts of deindustrialized America that were satellites of the industrial system. Place Chester, Pennsylvania, Benton Harbor, Michigan, Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, where someone recently just was, right? Those are the places that have been cut off, that don't have good pathways to 21st century prosperity. That's the system we have to rebuild. So that's answering my own question. We have some really human and technical challenges to making what would seem to be straightforward actually commonplace. We have to, you know, we're taking a piece of this, right? We're not trying to be full revolutionaries. We're trying to be, take a focused piece on using this idea of indicator and response, which is sort of more generalizing the idea of early warning systems. And we have to be real. What can that do? What can that not do, right? And really focus on where it has its strong value add. That's a thing for us to talk about. We know that we've got this really solid research and lived experience that this, you know, this powerful idea of the ABCs, attendance, behavior, course performance, right? You got to show up, you got to be focused, you got to do the work. Blocking and tackling, if you do that, and we have some decent teaching and some you know, decent equity and other experiences, you'll make it. So they become very powerful indicators. They're actionable. They're things schools can organize around. That's why they made a lot of difference. Do we want to mess with that or not? Right? As we try to extend this to post-secondary and beyond. Are there other indicators we need to add? Or does that make it too confusing? And we lose more than we gain. That's, I think, a key thing we want this group to really work through over the next couple of years, actually. And then how do we think about a response system as opposed to just interventions or just programmatic responses, right? Because right now, if we were honest, I think most of our responses to indicators tend to be programmatic, tend to be, you know, narrow-focused, often kid-directed, which is part of its strength and part of why it works, but also, what about taking a slightly more systematic lens to things? What is the most strategic level of intervention? It might be at the individual level, but it might be at the class level, it might be at the school level, it might be at the district level, it might be at the systems level. And if we're trying to really build a strong response to those indicators, and we're saying baseline it's at least a third of our kids, right? We're not going to be able to individually intervene our way out of that, right? We're not going to be able to make tailored, specifically kid-specific, only that kid interventions for multiple years for 1/3 of our students, right? That's would push our bounds of our human capacity and how we fund our education system, right? Because we can't give everybody Aristotle as their tutor, right? If we could, like, we might be able to individualize our way out, but we don't have the organizational ability to do that. So we're going to have to think about moving more to systematic and systems and levels of response as opposed to just purely individualized, customized, even though retaining that ability to do so, because for many kids, that's what's going to be necessary. So that's another broad theme we're going to be thinking about. And basically, the way we've organized this work, and we want some feedback as we keep refining it, but this came from our year of planning and dialoguing with all of you and some others, is really to have 3 work groups going forward. One really tackling this data visualization indicator side, like how do I make sense of all this data in a way that a teacher can, and a principal, and school folks and parents can act upon it, so it doesn't just become lots of numbers floating in the air but not much action. We want another group thinking this question about more indicators or not, what's gained, what's lost, as we really stretch to post-secondary and that connection. And there's a lot of interest in social, emotional, and other areas. We're going to hear from folks in the field doing that work today to see what they're learning as they pioneer it. And then another group working on this response system idea. Now that we have this, if we get better data and it's really actionable and we have the best indicators and we have a whole continuum, we can really keep kids, we know when they sort of need help, how do we organize all that help, right? Because that might be the most revolutionary part of all the work, right? It's really thinking how we respond to keep everybody on that pathway. So that's what we're setting up as our big macro challenge for ourselves. We've organized today to be sort of the thinking day, and tomorrow will be the organizing day. So we're going to hear a little bit in a minute, help us give some big visions on how to keep this all together. Then we're going to hear about the higher ed K-12 connection and really start thinking how to really leverage that for this work. Then we'll hear from some practitioners in the field about social emotional, and then in the afternoon, Jenny will lead us through a way to really start thinking about this more or less or different or additional indicator idea. And then we'll do a final session where we'll think about this response systems. And then tomorrow, we'll dig a little deeper and we'll think about how to keep ourselves organized going forward. So where I want to leave you, and then if anybody has some clarifying questions or like, what are we doing here? You have 30 seconds to get ready for that. So this is where we ended. As he said, we had a whole year of planning work where we met with various groups, nonprofits, higher ed folks, practitioners, advocacy folks, and we had a meeting about this size with the practitioners just about a year ago, and we were really trying to get to our vision. What are we trying to do here? Like, how do we summarize what we're doing? And this is the slide we came up with, and we're going to, in a minute, have you guys, you can offer amendments from the floor to this vision, because we think it's important that we all have a common vision before we get going. But I'll just let you read it. It's also on the very top of your agenda, if it's too hard to read the screen. That's really where we ended our work last year. So that's where we'll begin with it this year. All right, what the heck are we doing here? Clarification questions before we move on? All right, great. So, and we're going to come back at lunch and get a little more details into the nuts and bolts of how we're going to organize ourselves. But basically what we're trying to do here in these day and a half is we're trying to refine that vision statement. We're trying to get people who are not yet part of the work groups excited and volunteering to be part of those work groups. We're going to ask all of you in the course of our time here to look at the framing questions we have to help those work groups and help us amend them and improve them and add to them so they have all our wisdom before they go forth and do their work group work. And the idea is the work groups are trying to tackle some of these human and technical challenges, right? Spend some time on it and then report back to us. And we're sort of big meetings like this on an annual cycle. And then we're really trying over a 3-year period to move the whole field forward. It's really our big macro goal. So we're having work groups work on it, come back, wisdom of the whole group, and keep working on it. In the end, we're trying to really get the sense of some core shared understandings of the field. Because the other key part of this work, why I thought it's so important, is if we don't have some sort of idea of a network of networks that's collectively working on this, there's a real chance for fragmentation. That everybody interprets early warning a different way, everybody interprets college readiness a different way, everybody interprets persistence a different way. Some people form partnerships with higher ed, some don't. Some people just do this because it's a mandate and they're trying to do the best they can. Some people do it because it's a passion. And if you think of it, there's not some sense of just an organizing collective. Let still people go do their work as they want to do it, but this organizing collective helps bring our wisdom together, helps codify some key learnings, creates a shared set of resources so you don't have to reinvent the wheel every time you start new. And as people enter this area, they don't have to start, they can start at the knowledge frontier or closer to it and not just like we're going to have to relearn everything other folks have been doing it. So that's a big purpose of this. So that gets this idea we're going to also start asking for suggestions for the resource guides and curation of what is the stuff we think is really solid, that is ready to be shared, where is areas where we need, we have to learn more. So with that, I want to first recognize Joanna Fox, who has made it through DC and Baltimore traffic, who I think has probably talked to every one of you. And she will be joining us shortly as we work through the day. And now I actually want to bring up, we're going to have two people give us sort of a macro frame. Like if this is our vision, let's think about some macro frames about how we might get there. And again, this is just to get us starting thinking. And then after we hear those macro frames, we're going to give you a little bit of time at your table to work on your amendments to the vision. That's how we're going to do our first diving in. So I'm going to ask Angela to come forward to give us one of those frames built around systems and equity thinking.
Good morning, everyone. Oh, that's actually pretty good. I am in a room of educators. One more time, good morning, everyone. All right, sometimes I have to do that 3 or 4 times, but as a former teacher, yeah, there you go. I like that call and response in the morning, make sure everyone is here and awake and all that stuff. Also, I grew up in the Black church, so call and response is in my DNA. My name is Angela Romans, and I work at the Annenberg Institute for School Reform at Brown University. And Joanna, who, like Bob said, talked to all of us, asked me to speak kind of briefly about an aspect of our work and what we're learning in our work in the field around indicator and supports development for young people for student success. So I said, of course, Joanna, whatever you ask me to do, I will do. So I organized this in themes from the field, themes from our work at the Annenberg Institute in the field. And a lot of these organizing principles come out of our work in the College Readiness Indicator Systems project, which there are some CRIS folks in the room. My colleague Mike Grady says hello to the CRIS band, so those of you who are in the CRIS band. But it was a project that was funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation to look at college readiness indicator systems and how to support college readiness for all young people. And so we partnered with 2 research institutes, the Chicago Consortium and the John Gardner Center at Stanford, and also 5 urban school districts around the country to look at indicator and response systems. And one of the things that really distinguished CRIS from earlier efforts is its tri-level approach. So I'll talk about that for a little bit. Traditionally, early warning systems and college readiness indicator systems had really been about individual students and looking at the individual student level and making sure that they had the right supports and interventions for their success. But with CRIS, one of the things that it revealed is that these specific responses to individual student needs can also have a different level, 2 different levels of analysis. So we really talked about this tri-level approach. And at the individual student level, yes, I mean, I think that's pretty self-explanatory for a lot of our work, but we also looked at the notion of school-level indicators and supports. So what are the kinds of cultural and organizational practices at the school level that create the right conditions for student success? And also at the system level, which we defined as the school district and the partners that work with the school district to support student success. Again, creating those conditions for student success. So what are the resources, the policies, and the practices at that system level or ecosystem level that create those conditions or that don't create those conditions for student success? So one example is one indicator that's been used a lot in college readiness is access to higher level courses, to honors courses, college prep courses, AP, IB, those kinds of courses. So at the individual level, participation in college prep courses is a student level indicator, right? How are students participating? How are they scoring in those courses? How are they grading and scoring on those exams? But at the school level, the indicator that we looked at is access to college prep level coursework. Do all students in a school have access to those courses? If not, why not? What are the kinds of policies? What are the kinds of barriers that are there for access for some students? And how are schools organizing themselves to give all students access to those college courses and making sure that they're successful as well, so making sure they have the right preparation, et cetera. And then at the broader system level, at the district and partner level, what are the right supports for making sure that all students across the district have access to those courses? So do all schools have honors courses and AP courses? If not, why not? What kinds of policies and practices can be put into place? Are higher education institutions partnering with school districts to make their courses available? Are there state level policies and funding for students to take those kinds of courses? So those are the kinds of questions and indicators that we were looking at the individual school and system level to really analyze whether there are the right conditions for that student success. So the goal was to generate actionable knowledge at all of those different levels, and so that we were looking at not just the outputs at the student level, but the inputs. What are we as the adults doing to create those right conditions? And as Bob was saying, what are the human and technical barriers if they're not those conditions? So that there is both accountability and support for the students in the system and also the adults in the system, which is a very important part of CRIS for us. So that is a really important unifying theme for our work, and that has informed a lot of our work around indicator development. So as a theme from the field, we at CRIS termed it beyond test scores, really looking at indicators of student success as both beyond just the academic test scores, but also beyond the individual level, and looking at the school level and the system level as really important units of analysis. And then secondly, that schools and districts can't do it all, which I think all of us in the room know, but not everyone outside the education field knows, and our accountability systems aren't always set up to support that truth from the field. So we need cross-sector collaboration, and we also need inside and outside strategies. So not only in the traditional sort of grass tops partners at the system level, but also the grassroots. So making sure that parents are active partners, that youth students are active partners themselves, that other residents in the community are active partners as well. And then finally, putting equity at the center, which we know is critical for our work, but really not only just identifying the gaps and barriers that happen across students, but looking at the root causes of equity gaps that happen around race, around gender, around socioeconomic status, around geography, Immigrant status, is, we know some schools are starting to report attendance and chronic absence going up, and looking at student immigration status and their families, and understanding, again, some of the policies and practices that are root causes at those. And when we say all students, all means all. That's what equity means, and that not every student will have the same kind of supports, exactly the same supports to meet their needs. So those are the three kind of big high-level themes from the field that are supporting and driving our work in the indicator development field. And then the last thing that Joanna asked me to do was to end with a framework. So we're good at putting together visual frameworks. So this is from our More and Better Learning Time, our Time for Equity framework that my colleague Jaime Del Raso has been leading in our work. And it visually, I think, captures what Bob was talking about in terms of that real system level approach and trying to make sure that we are approaching our work from a systems frame. So there were 24 indicators that we put together around student access to expanded learning opportunities, but I think this framework really captures a lot of the work that we are doing in the field around student success. So, and it's really framed around that tri-level approach. So as you can see, the bridge around the yellow bridge is about cross-sector collaboration. And so all of these sectors, from researchers, foundations, educational nonprofits, teachers unions, et cetera, are coming together to support the students and schools and families and communities that are really at the center of the framework. This bridge is connoting their connection. So not only coming together to support, but in a strategic and connected way. And then also noticing that there are arrows coming from the students at the center to those different partners, and those arrows are bidirectional. And so that is connoting the influence both ways, from and to the students in center, students at the center as well as the partners, so that all of these different sectoral partners are not only just influencing the students and families and supporting them, which we know is important, but also that students and schools and families are actors in the ecosystem and are also influencing and shaping the policies and practices that are happening at all of these sectors that are, again, working together, as Bob was saying, in a systematic way to make sure that students and families are successful in their path toward higher education and beyond. So that is a very quick framing of the work that we have been doing from the field in the Annenberg Institute. We've been working on, we've been funded by the Kellogg Foundation to really create the research base for parent leadership indicators, again, looking at that inside-outside strategy, and youth development indicators as well. So those are two of the areas that we're working at in this ecosystem approach. And I look forward to the conversation over the next couple of days. Thanks.
Thank you. All right, great. So that gives us this sort of like multi-systems level idea of how to frame our work. And we have to be operating at multiple levels: the student level, the school level, the systems level, how to get the community in, and how to have that influence back out. Another frame I think is very important is more from the kids' point of view, which is that you can lead a horse to water, right? But so if students are not deeply engaged in the work they're doing, right, they're not going to invest all the time, energy, and effort we need, because this is a long pathway. This is part of the change, right? Used to be you could make it to 17 and you could become an adult, right? We're now saying you got to make it to like 25, right? That's a big change, right? And if people aren't bought into it, it's a long slog, right? So we're going to hear about some really deep thinking on the student engagement frame in a minute. But I just one thought I leave here is the way I think about this is like, while we're creating these systems of support, we also just have to really make sure that the student's internal engine is being built. Because in the end, they have to be the driver of their own success, right? We can't just create things, just get on the conveyor belt and it'll take you somewhere, right? It doesn't really work out that well if we try that. We need the conveyor belt. Everyone's got to have a pathway. But if we don't build your internal engine to be your own navigator, your own person to push forward, right, it's not going to work. So let's hear about building that internal engine. Yes. One more. Thank you.
Very much. Appreciate you. Yep. Appreciate you. Good morning. Good morning. Good morning. The name is Kuh, K-U-H. How many of you speak German? You know what does that mean, in German? Oh, it's good, just as well. My daughter, unfortunately, spilled the goods in her 4th grade class. They were talking about ethnic background. It means cow. Typically used in a derogatory way. I come to you from several places. My current post is at something called the National Institute for Learning Outcomes Assessment and Operation. Well, it's described in one of your handouts here. But I spent 34 years on the faculty at Indiana University, and we built a number of different survey instruments, and the best known happened to be about this topic called student engagement. None of us, I mean, we're all here kind of for the same general reason. None of us wants our kids or neighbors to grow up to be career lab rats. There's not much of a future in it. And we also have another frame, another perspective that's driving our interest in our work. The biggest challenge I think we have, and it's been hinted at so far, is students choosing the wrong parents. It sounds facetious, but it is the biggest challenge we face. So the notions of what we do, and I'm going to be focused specifically really on what institutions can do, but if we don't, as we've already heard from the opening segment here, have some sense of how to organize communities and churches and other neighborhood groups, a lot of what we're talking about we'll be talking about maybe in the same ways 20 and 50 years from now. So how do we help people who've fallen in? What might we do? My focus today is on student engagement. It's a very simple set of propositions. These are the two most important. Bob just mentioned this, the time, and I want to focus on energy, or maybe a better phrase, quality of effort that students expend as they work through these so-called educationally purposeful tasks. And then what we do. Most of my work, almost all of my work has been at the post-secondary level, but as you'll see in a moment, we've dabbled a bit in high schools with this concept. How do we organize these kinds of learning experiences? And they're not all within the walls, if you will, of the campus or school building. How do we design learning experiences that either, the soft word is induce, but essentially require students to do the things that we know will prepare them to succeed later. And so there have been lots of studies. Some of you may be familiar with this book by Ernie Pascarella and Pat Teranzini, my friends, the Pizza Brothers. But this work was focused on post-secondary learning outcomes. They've done this massive synthesis several times, and one of the few unequivocal conclusions we can draw about human behavior, and particularly what matters in college, is this notion of investing time and energy on purposeful tasks, both inside and outside the classroom. And again, I'm thinking here mostly in the post-secondary setting, but you can see it happen on playing fields and concert stages at the secondary level as well. When students get connected to something that is important to them, they are more likely to survive and thrive and put forth, even if they don't want to, the effort it takes to succeed academically. And we know this simple notion. It's much more complicated than time on task, and I don't have enough time to get into the complicating factors here. But time on task really does matter, but not necessarily the kinds of tasks we've come to think of as standard and routine. And so we know the more engaged a student is, the more they do the straightforward things like read and write, the more they write. And there's some very sobering information about how much students write, and we wonder then why, when they get to post-secondary education, they struggle with their writing. Well, we don't ask enough of them, frankly. As we'll see in a moment. But the more engaged a student is, the more time they spend interacting with peers around substantive matters, the more they're asked to work on concrete problems, taking what they're learning in the academic sense and seeing how those ideas work in concrete, real-life, meaningful, relevant, that's a key word, relevant settings, the more they're likely to expend effort. Their grades are better, they're more satisfied, and they're more likely to show gains on the kinds of desired outcomes we're after. So we've been dabbling with, not dabbling, hell, this has been pretty systematic work. We, since 2000, we've been working with different kinds of surveys. The two big ones are NSSE, National Survey of Student Engagement, and the Community College Survey of Student Engagement. How many of you are familiar with either or both of those? So some fraction, mostly the people probably in the post-secondary setting. NSSE, for example, has been used by close to 1,700 different four-year colleges and universities in North America. It's now being used widely in South Africa and Australia, Canada. Almost every university in Canada has used the NSSE, and the Community College Survey, CESI, similarly. But I want to call your attention, the third bullet down, to the HESI. You're getting the drift here about how this stuff works. The High School Survey of Student Engagement was launched, but only existed for several years in the mid-2000s. The No Child Left Behind drove this puppy out of the school walls, but it was producing very, very interesting, and the word actionable, data about what schools could do, identifying students who were more or less engaged. These data can be broken down by different demographic characteristics, levels of schooling, and we don't need to get into that level, I guess. So, okay, here's the audience participation. Now just think back, those of you who have had conversations with college, university faculty members, what is it they routinely say about the amount of time students should spend preparing for class for every credit hour? What's the mantra? 2 to 1, right? For every class hour credit. So if you're taking, it's a 3-hour class, you ought to be spending 9 hours preparing. And if you're a full-time student, 15, 16 hours. How many hours a week should a college student spend preparing for class, whatever that looks like? Do the math. 30. Okay, that's good. Now, how many hours does the typical first-year college student spend preparing for class? Let's get a show of hands. I did this with the provost on my campus once and asking people to stand up to vote. Don't ever do that, because when they get it wrong, you embarrass the provost. How many say A? 7 to 10? All right, that's a pretty healthy proportion to third. How many say B? 11 to 15? How many of you say 25 or more? E. Anybody? Actually, there are a few, and these are averages, right? And averages can belie a lot of very important information. So it's 11 to 15. It's really when we do focus groups, it's really on the lower end of that. Now, you should be getting a picture in your mind's eye here of what faculty think is needed to perform well, what students, first-year students themselves will do. How about a high school senior? How many hours a week do you think a high school senior? Now, those of you who do that, well, that's not what you think it means. It doesn't mean zero. Although none of the above. You psychometricians out there, if you see none of the above, that's often the correct answer. But it's not, it's 5. Again, some students are spending many more hours than that. This is not Lake Wobegon, though. There are students who are spending fewer hours than that. And when you dig in, and by the way, these HESI data, unfortunately, are dated. But I don't think for a moment this has changed very much. Even though high school graduation rates have gone up, we don't need to focus on this. What this is showing is too few students are expending a fair amount of effort, more than they thought they could, to succeed. Too few students are writing enough, just as an example. These are very concrete examples. It can get more complicated as we go. Look at this chart. Some of you know maybe all of you are aware of the UCLA survey that's done every year. They've been doing it for close to 50 years. And the percentage of students starting college who say their average grades in high school were, as you can see. And you can see, I come from a school of education, like the Johns Hopkins School, so you can see what a terrific job we have done preparing teachers to get student achievement up to, okay, no, we're not going there. This is a dramatic and almost embarrassing shift in terms of grades. This explains why I didn't do very well in college. I was one of those C students in '69. But if you juxtapose these different data slices, you can see we have not all, and maybe not most, but we have a lot of students starting college who are less well prepared really, not just in terms of reading, writing, and arithmetic, but in developing the habits of the heart and mind, the grit, the self-mediated behavior. Yesterday in fact, today is coming out, employers say one of the least developed senses of performance in the workplace is a work ethic. Where do students develop a work ethic when it comes to their performance? So, quite obvious. Again, I think we can get a little more complicated and deeper if we have time to talk about it. Many students during their high school years just aren't behaving, and I say behaving, this is a combination of what students themselves expect, are willing to do, and how we put them in situations, learning the assignments that we design, whether they have any practical relevance. Many students will perform much better when they can see meaning and relevance in their work. And the same can be said for college students. It was briefly mentioned this morning that you might get in, but surviving and thriving in college requires more than apparently the effort that they put forth. So how does this miracle occur? Well, we don't have all the time we need today to talk about that. And the 5 priorities there are many more priorities, of course, as you know. What frustrates me, and I'm sure frustrates many, if not all of you, is we know a lot about what works. We just do. We don't know everything, and there's more to learn, but if we just use 10% of what we know, we'd probably see dramatic improvement in student performance. We need to make sure the money's going to where it matters. This is a very difficult thing. We almost never see institutions design, I use the word sunset programs and practices that are less effective or reaching a tiny fraction of students when that money, human resources, can be reinvested and reallocated. We need to find better ways, more frequently, of designing activities that get students to apply what they're learning in real time, in things that matter to them. I'm really fascinated, finally, by this movement in math, where instead of algebra, we're now using quantitative reasoning, giving students assignments that they can actually use on a daily basis to develop this sense of how to make sense of the world in quantitative terms. We discovered when we did a review of the lit years ago that the federal government paid for but never released. Sound familiar? That goal realization was very important to seeing students stay in school, even work through obstacles. Goal realization, seeing the meaning of what it is they're studying, maybe just one course out of 4, where they can find ways to apply what they're learning. So this is why we've seen a juggernaut. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the phrase high-impact practices. Have you seen? I know some of you have seen this. It's all over the waterfront now in post-secondary education, and I'm sure there's an analog in K-12 where students who study abroad or do an internship or are in an intensive writing course or they do a service learning course. Service learning is a great example where the faculty person has got students working outside the classroom to see how what they're learning inside actually works in real life. And students are going back to their communities. There's a double bump here. Students see what they're learning has relevance, but they're also enriching the lives of people in their home communities. We've got to find better ways, more frequent ways of getting students to apply what they're learning. And then, of course, we need the data. You know, this gathering is more about the data maybe than pedagogical innovation and so on, but we need to measure and act on what matters. So we know a lot, and if we could only be more of us, more intentional about using the things, the policies, practices, levers that work, we'd get a lot further. Thanks very much.
All right, so what we try to do is to spark some thinking here, right? We heard more about how we can create a individual school systems thinking, and then now how we connect the experience of high school, senior year, to the beginning of college, and perhaps some disconnects between expectations in one place and the other, and this idea that students have got to be engaged for this long arc of pathways to happen. And we want you to use that and your own experiences to return to our vision statement, which again is in the very top of your agenda. It's an easy place to see it at your table. And what we're trying to do with our pathways to adult success and the next generation of indicators and responses. And the question we're going to ask you to talk with at your table now is, do we need to make amendments to this? Or is this pretty good? Is there things we'd add or change if we want to have, when people say, what are you guys doing with this crazy pathways to adult success, next generation indicator and response systems? We want to have confidence that we all sort of agree this is what we're doing. So we're going to give you a little bit of time to look at it, read it yourself, discuss it with your table, and just at your table decide, does it need to be amended or not, or things added based on what we've heard today or in your own experiences. And I'll just add one insight that connects our two talks together about how we're trying to toggle between this idea of building a student's internal engine and them sort of doing what's necessary for themselves to succeed and helping them show what that is and making it possible for that to happen, but also making sure the institutional and systematic responses are correct and supportive of that. So one interesting thing about that grade data we saw is that one change that's happened between those times is it's almost impossible to go to a flagship state university now without a B average, right? The institutions have put a barrier there that says, you can't, my son just went through it, you can't go to the University of Maryland. Don't even really bother applying at College Park unless you have a B average, right? They don't actually take C students at state university flagship universities anymore. They actually did back in, right? So part of the shifting responses of the lower grades of K-12, in fact, are responding to signals from the higher ed, and it's vice versa. So we have to think about that two-way dialogue as we try to sort that out. And that's really why we tried to get folks from both sides of the aisle in the room today. All right, so take a minute, talk with your table. Let us know where you think we are in our vision statement. So here what we want to do is just have a little discussion about if somebody wants to propose an amendment to the floor to our vision. And we have some microphones in the back, so if you raise your hand, we'll get a microphone to you, and we'll have a little dialogue here before we move on to a very power-packed higher ed K-12 panel.
Okay.
All right, do we have an amendment from the floor?
Right here? Just be careful of the speaker behind you.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. It's me, back here. Dave.
And tell us who you are also.
Sure. David Thomas, Associate Vice President and Dean, Community College of Philadelphia. Okay, so we did some wordsmithing back here. Yes, and I have a lot of marks on my paper, so I'll probably screw this completely up when I try to reread the vision, but I'm going to take a stab at it. We said we'd like to propose to enable all youth, regardless of their needs, circumstances, places of residence, and prior experiences, to obtain the competencies needed to complete secondary and enroll and persist to completion in a post-secondary pathway to reach their full potential.
Very nice. All right.
Good job, good job.
Yes. And we'll use consensus of the room as opposed to formal voting on each amendment. All right. And we have expert note takers in the back that will help us wordsmith. Okay, another amendment.
Hi, you know who I am. Basically, we second that. That's pretty much exactly what we said. The only thing we would add is for schools and systems to enable all youth.
Ah. You listen to your own PowerPoint. Awesome. All right, that's a good one. Do we have another amendment from the floor? Over there? Yeah, Richard?
I just was thinking, as she stated that, should it only be schools and systems, or should it be families and communities as well?
All right. Well, do we have a murmur of consent on families and communities? Okay, thank you. Okay, we have Richard over here.
My name's Eric McIntosh. I'm with Civitas Learning. So my question, just coming out of that, then is it the school systems that and communities that enable the student, or is the student enabled by them? So who enables whom? So is it something in my mind? It's something that the student comes forth from the student because of the enablement from those different communities who are supporting them.
Good question. We'll have a committee wrestle with it. No. Yes, yes. True enough. Anybody else want to bring an amendment forth?
I rise with a question as to procedure,
Okay.
but, or more exactly, all right,
Do I need a
would be
gavel?
formal. I will be being less formal. I speaking for myself, although
Yeah.
we discussed it at the table, but speaking for
Yeah,
myself,
yeah.
I oppose the deletion of the reference to a family supporting wage.
I agree.
I think that anchors us in a way that ties us to a specific set of concerns, and full potential is vast in a way that we could never get at and never tell if we got there. That's,
Nice point.
I know
like
that's
that.
out of
Yep,
order, having been
yep.
asked for motions first.
No. That's a good counter amendment to the prior amendment.
Oh, we got one.
So
there,
note
but we'll get
taken.
you
All right.
next.
I just have a clarifying question for the gentleman from Philadelphia. Can you just read that last section about post-secondary?
Here's a mic.
So yes, we said to obtain the competencies needed to complete secondary and enroll and persist to completion in a post-secondary pathway. So you want to know why we decided to wordsmith it as such?
No, we wanted to wordsmith it too. I just
Oh,
wanted.
gotcha.
Does our table feel like that aligns with our feelings?
Okay, cool. Okay. Sure. So I don't necessarily know if we removed 2 years as much as we saw 2 years. So I'm a community college guy, right? So I understand that a student can actually complete a community college certificate in less than 2 years and earn a livable wage. That's one of the reasons. But we also felt like 2 years does not necessarily connote a student who is transferring as well, too. That is completion. So I figured if you talk about completion of a post-secondary degree, that would mean 2 years, even less than 2 years, that still leads to a livable wage.
We didn't want to be satisfied if four-year college students got completed 2 years. That was, we also saw it as lowering our expectations.
All right, over here.
Good morning, Beatriz Tendon with Arizona State University. Just on the point regarding a family supporting wage, our table had a discussion around replacing that, but still making that point with the term economic resiliency, because that's really what we're driving at, is withstanding the ebbs and flow of the economy as a result of your post-secondary degree.
Thanks. All right, we're waking up over there. All right.
Hi, this is not representative of the table, but it's something I feel very strongly about. I agree that the living wage is important, but I want to insert civic competencies in here somewhere, or
Yep.
social and civic
Yep.
competencies, not just geared
Yep.
toward the workplace.
Yep. I mean, that's centered to this idea that this really needs to be an act of social integration as well as sort of economic development. So I like that.
I think my comment is
Yeah, one back here.
is reflected in the economic resiliency, but there is so little almost nothing about learning outcomes in this statement. I mean, I realize these other levels of achievement are important. I'm not arguing against any of them, but I think the notion of developing the proficiencies that enable one to become economically and civically and socially and I'm not wordsmithing. You got to figure out how to get it in there if you think it's worth putting in there.
Yeah. And what's interesting on that is that in our last time we did this a year ago, the very hot debate and why it got put out there in sort of key parentheses was this idea. There was a very strong feeling from some that we had to really say that it had to be a high school diploma that meant something. And that's where this sort of standards-based idea came in. And that's your sort of academic outcomes argument, that maybe we have to extend that to the higher ed space too. But so noted. All right, any final comments? Going once, going twice? 3 times? All right, we will work on incorporating some of that and sharing it back out tomorrow, so we have our collective product. All right, we're gonna hear one more interactive panel. No, wait, we're gonna have a break. Sorry, very important. Break, yes.